Yevamos Daf Kuf Yud Aleph contains two Mishnayos. The first part of the Daf is a highly complex sugya discussing what happens when two women who are co-wives fall to Yibum together, and one or two of the Yevams do Yibum to both of them. What is the halacha in these scenarios? Now, the Mishnah brings up the cases is deep into the Daf, and the Gemara discusses it before we get to the Mishnah. So we'll see the Mishnah first, and that way we can have the background to understand what the Gemara's discussion is. So there are three possible situations, three possible halachic statuses we could have for the woman who's falling to Yibum. She could be a Gedola Pikachas, a regular healthy woman, in which case she's Vadai married to the original husband, and if a Yibum is performed to her, it's a Vadai Yibum, and nothing can occur after that. She is the first one. Anything else that happens afterwards is just a Maisa Znos. If anybody tries to do Yibum to another co-wife of hers, it's a Maisa Znos. It doesn't create any problems for her. She is a Vadai confirmed wife. There's no issues. If, however, she is a Kitana, the Gemara will say that her original marriage was a suffix. Now, if it was a suffix, then the Yibum that is performed to her was also a suffix, and we don't know, therefore, if that Yibum is Chal or not. We're going to have to consider both possibilities. The Yibum may have been Chal, and therefore what happens afterwards is nothing, or the Yibum may have not been Chal, and what happens afterwards is a Yibum, but in that situation, then she was never married to the original husband in the first place, on the side that there was no Yibum. She's not a co-wife, she's not a tzara, she's not a Yevama at all. Now, the most complex scenario is where you have a chareshes. The halacha of a chareshes, the Gemara will say, is that she's considered to be partially married. That is, she has a partial marriage, and when the Yibum is done to her, there's a partial Yibum, which leaves room for another Yibum to be performed, but that Yibum is Aser. So that Yibum is Chal, but it's Aser. When that happens, you have a situation where two women have both had a Yibum Chal, the chareshes first, and whoever comes after her, unless that woman is also a chareshes. And therefore, you now have two Yibums in one household, and they aser each other because that is not allowed. You cannot have two Eishesachs done Yibum in the same household. So now let's go through the Mishnah and the cases that we present there, which underline and explain these concepts. And then the Gemara will go through it with a lot of ways of deriving halachos based on these Mishnayos and explaining them. So the Mishnah begins by saying that if the two women that are falling to Yibum are on equal footing, there's no problem created. Whoever goes first is married, and whoever comes afterwards is not. So let's say you have two Kitanos Isomos. So they both are a suffix marriage. They both fall to Yibum, and a brother does Yibum to one, and then he or the same one does Yibum to the second one. So there's no issues here, because if, of course, they are suffix married. So if they are both married, then the Yibum to the first one is Chal. The Yibum to the second one is the Maises Nus. It's not a Yibum. And therefore the first one's married, the second one's not. If they're both not married, then they are not Yevamos at all. And there are just two random women that married two men or the same man, and there's no Isser at all. Now, if they're both Chareshos, so they both had a partial marriage, their marriages are on equal footing. And if you do Yibum to both of them, whatever the first one did doesn't leave room for the second one, because the second one is a partial marriage. The second one is just as partial as the first one, and therefore the first one's Chal and not the second one. Now, what happens if you have combinations of different types of women? And here's where it starts getting very complex. Let's go to the end of the Mishnah first. What happens if you have a Pikachas and a Chareshes? So if the Pikachas goes first, her marriage is complete, or the Chareshes does Yibum afterwards counts as nothing, and therefore there's no Isser on anybody. However, if the Chareshes goes first, she has a partial marriage, and now she leaves room for the Pikachas to do a Yibum afterwards, because she's only partial. Therefore, the Yibum of the Pikachas will aser the Chareshes. The Chareshes is now in a situation where two women did Yibum in the same household, violating the Isser of Eishesach, violating the Isser of Bayis Echad U'Baina Ve'ena Baina Shnei Batim. And therefore, the Chareshes has now become aser, and she cannot stay with him. The Gemara will discuss what she can do exactly. Now, what if you had a Pikachas Gedola and a Katana? So, of course, if the Pikachas went first, there's no problem, because nothing can be Chal afterwards. If the Katana went first, now we have a suffix. We don't know if the Katana was married, and therefore the Pikachas did nothing, or if the Katana, who went first, wasn't married at all, wasn't involved in this situation at all. So the Gemara says the Ketana is puzzle. We don't know what her status is, and the Tanakama holds that way. Rabbi Elazar argues, and he says the Ketana could always do miyun, and therefore we tell this Ketana do miyun, get out of this, cancel the original marriage in the first place, and therefore the marriage to the Gedola will be chal, and what you did is not any effect at all. Now, what happens if you have the Ketana and the Chareshes together? So here's where it gets really complex. If the Chareshes had Yibum first, it's partial. It leaves room for another one. The Ketana comes later. Safek, whether or not her Yibum counted or not, we have to assume l'chumra that it did count. And therefore, you have two women that are both had Yibum, and you have to passel the Chareshes who had a partial Yibum. If, however, the Ketana went first, so now if the Ketana had a complete marriage and she has a complete Yibum, then the Chareshes has zero effect, and she should theoretically be able to go free. If the Ketana had no effect, and then the Chareshes is married, then the Ketana was not a Yibum at all. She was not married to the first husband. The Yibum, which she tried to do to the brother, is just a regular marriage. The Chareshes is unrelated, and the Chareshes should be able to stay married. Shouldn't be any issue. The problem is that Chazal made a takana, and they were afraid that you would confuse this case with the case where the Chareshes went first, and the Chareshes is puzzle. And therefore, according to our Girsa and our Mishnah, we made Xer here and we puzzled the Chareshes as well, even though she should be fine because she went first, because the Ketana went first. In the Mishnayos, it rules that there is no Gzeira and the Chareshes is fine. Okay, now we're going to start the Gemara. The Gemara is commenting on our previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah discusses where you had a man married to both a Ketana and a Chareshes. Here you didn't have two Yibums. The Mishnah there just explains that the Yibum or Chalitza of one of them does not pater the other one. And the explanation we've seen it because we don't know which one is the real wife. We don't know which one the husband wanted. They are both not complete marriages. One's a safek, one's a partial. So what do you do? So the Mishnah had said you have to the Yibum or Chalitza of one doesn't pater the other. And in the Gemara, Rav said that the solution is as follows. The Chareshes, he has to marry, he has to do a Yibum too, then he can divorce her. He can send her away. He cannot do Chalitza to the Chareshes because Chalitza does not work on a Chareshes, she can't speak. And that's a halacha we've seen the last few daf. Now, the Ketana, she could get Chalitza, but not when she's a Ketana. So wait until she grows up and then she gets Chalitza. It does not have to do Yibum to her. Now, the Gemara begins commenting on the Mishnah and on Rav. So the Gemara says that Rav Chizda, who quoted Rav Chizda says, we could see from the Mishnayos that the Ketana and the Chareshes are not the same type of marriage. The Gemara here has not yet said that one's a safek, one is a partial. The Gemara says that now. The Gemara says that it cannot be that both are sfekos. It can't be that both are partial. And therefore, one is a safek, one is a partial. And based on Rav, I could figure out which one. Now, why can't it be that they both are partial? That can be because then they're on equal footing, and our Mishnah wouldn't make sense to say that if you do even to one of them, it doesn't pater the other one. Why not? They're both partially married. They are equal. The yibum of one should end whatever connection there is here, and the other one should be able to go free. So that can't be. It also can't be that they're both a safek, because if that would be the case, so then the Mishnah on today's daf doesn't make sense when it says that if you do yibum to both of them, they passel each other. It shouldn't be. Whichever one goes first should be the one that's chal misafek. Why? Because if that one was a real marriage, and the yibum that happened to her is real, anything that happens afterwards is meaningless. It's a vade marriage. It didn't leave any room for the second action, and therefore the second one should not count as anything. The mais is nus. It was a mais is nus. It was an isra shazach, but it didn't passel anything. The first one is good and chal. If the first one is not married, if they are both not married, that is, so then whoever went first didn't do anything, but it doesn't matter because they are not considered to be married to the original husband at all. They're both two random women. They never felt even in the first place. So if the Yavam or two brothers want to marry them, it shouldn't be any issue. There should be no problem of anybody passing anybody. Says Rav Chizda, therefore, I see from these Mishnayos that we cannot say that they're both sfegos, and we can't say that they are both partial. So one's a suffix, one's a partial. Now, based on Rav's halacha as to what they should do to be set free, I can conclude which one is the suffix and which one is the partial, and says Rav Chisda, the chareshes is the one that is the partial and leaves room, and the ketana is the one that's a suffix. The reasoning is as follows: since one is a partial and one's a suffix, they can't possibly both marry. That would be two yibums. That would be an iser. So you have to be able to do a chalitza or give a get to somehow send one of them away. Now, if the chareshes was the one who was a suffix, she shouldn't need to be sent away with a get. She should be able to do yibum without a problem. What are you going to do with the ketana? So the ketana in this approach would be able to get chalitza. Why can't you do chalitza to the ketana? She is a ketana, but a ketana could get chalitza, or certainly she get chalitza when she grows up. She was the partial, and therefore she can't be the one to marry. So give the ketana chalitza, let the charesha stay married. On the side that she was a full wife, then she's fine. On the side that she was not a wife at all, she isn't a wife at all. Either way, there's a chalitza on the ketana. But Rav doesn't say that solution because that solution doesn't work. The reason that solution doesn't work must be because the chareshes is the one who's a partial. And therefore, if the ketana were to do yibum, you wouldn't be able to do anything with the chareshes. The chareshes can't get chalitza. She'd be stuck. You wouldn't have any solution for her. So the only solution you could possibly have is for the chareshes to do yibum. Now the chareshes can't stay because the ketana also requires chalitza. Once the ketana requires a chalitza, since the chareshes was only partially married, the chalitza of the ketana makes her an achos chalitzaso. The chalitza of the ketana is not nothing because the chareshes was only partial. Now the chareshes is an achos chalitzaso. She can't stay married to her husband as an achos chalitzaso. Well, not as an achos chalitzaso, but as a bias echad hubone. And once there's a chalitza, she's a tzaras chalitzaso. She can't stay. Therefore, she has to get a get. Okay, says the Gemara further, Rav Sheshes agrees with Rav Chisda based on a different brisa. Rav Sheshes says, I could also prove to you from a different brisa that you're right, and that the ketana is the one who's a suffix, and the chareshes is the one who's a partial. Where do you see that? So the brisa discussing the same case with a new wrinkle. This is where you had two brothers married to two women. One was a ketana, one was a chareshes, and the two women, the ketana and the chareshes, were sisters. Therefore, when the husband of each of them, when he dies, you now have a case of a potential achos ishto falling to yibum. So the brisa paskins as follows. The brisa says that whichever husband dies, the remaining surviving husband has to divorce his wife because he doesn't have a complete marriage to his wife, and the zika of her sister now messes up his marriage. His wife is now an achos zikukaso. So let's go through it. So if the ketana's husband is the one who dies, and the chareshes falls to yibum, so the ketana is a suffix. Her marriage, we said, is a suffix, or the truth is, whichever one is the suffix. We don't know which one is. If it's the suffix who has her sister fall even to her husband, she can't stay with him because she might not be married to him, and her sister is for real, and her sister is falling to Yibam, and therefore she's now in a chos zikukaso. If it's the partial, that is whichever one is partially married, then her sister falls to Yibam. That also creates a zika because she's only partially married to her husband. And therefore, the zika, which is potentially real, it's a suffix if it's real or not, but it's potentially real, would interfere, and aser her marriage to her husband as a suffix, achos zikukaso. Therefore, both of them would have to divorce their wives, whichever one is the one who died. Now, obviously, they can't do yibum because we don't know the situation of the woman who's falling to them to Yibam could be an achos ishto or achos grushaso once they divorce their wives. Now, The Brisa says one line here at the end, which is where we'll get our proof from. It says, "What happens if the Chareshes was the one whose husband died? She fell to Yibam, to the husband of the Kitana. And then he goes without asking. He goes and he did Yibam. He did a bia with her. So the Brisa rules that the halacha is that there's no Isser that's created. He has to give her a get. The Yibam was a Yibam, possibly Misafik. He has to give her a get, and then she gets to go free. So the Gemara says, how do you understand this? If she was the partial and her sister, the Katana, was the Suffolk, it makes a lot of sense, because let's go through the possibilities here. If the Katana's marriage is a real marriage, so then this was nothing. This was an Achos Ishto falling to Yibam. There was no Zika. What they did was a Maises Nus, but she has no Zika, she's free. If the Katana was not married at all, on the side that her marriage is not a marriage, then the Yibam that she did is a regular Yibam. She just fell to Yibam. Her sister was not involved. Her sister was not married to her. Yavam, everything's fine. If, however, the Katana is the one who's a partial, so now this doesn't make sense, because when the Katana is married to the Yavam, there's a partial marriage there, and the Chareshes, who you want to say is the Suffolk, is falling to Yibam. So the marriage of the Katana is only partial. That means that the two marriages exist at the same time. On the tzad that the Chareshes is fully married, she has a full Zika, which goes on top of the Kitana's partial, and therefore, when he does the Yibam, that bia that he did was be'isr, because that was an achos zikukaso b'mixas. The Chareshes is a partial, the Chareshes is the sister of his wife, who is his partial wife, and the Chareshes had a real Zika, so it's a partial achos ishto, and that's an Isser that he did. Not only is it an Isser, it's a bia psula, because it's an achos ishto, b'mixas at least, and we have a rule that a bia psula doesn't count as a Yibam. It doesn't take the Zika of Yibam off. So on the tzad that the Chareshes really was his Yavam, that she was really married to her husband, that Zika was never dealt with, because the Bia that the Yavam did was a Psula. It was Psula because he was partially married to her sister. So therefore, this case, the halacha should be that she does not go free just by giving her a get. She needs a get and a chalitza, because her Zika was never fully removed. Must be, says Rav Sheshes, that it's not this way. It's the Katana is the one who's the Suffolk, and the Chareshes is the one who's the partial. Now, what should happen with the woman who's falling to Yibam here? So she can't do a Yibam, so they each are whatever their halacha is. When the Katana falls to Yibam, so the Katana could get a chalitza. So the Katana waits till she grows up, and she gets a chalitza, and she would leave. The Chareshes can never get chalitza. There is no chalitza of a Chareshes, and therefore the Chareshes would be stuck here forever. She can't do Yibam, and she would not have a solution. Even after the other wife is divorced, she's in achos kushaso, and there's nothing she can do. So it's Gemara, no, maybe that's not a taina. Maybe that's not a proof. Maybe this brisa is Rabbi Nechemia, and Rabbi Nechemia, we've seen earlier in the Masechta, holds that a bia psula does break the Zika. So that's why the Zika is broken, even though it's a bia psula. So this is where that can't be. I'll prove to you that Rabbi Nechemia is not involved over here. We have to be assuming that a bia psula does not break a Zika. And that's because if you look in the upcoming Mishnah, which we've already seen, we had over there the case of two women. One is a Chareshes, one's a Katana. They're not sisters. They're both married to the same man. He dies and they both fall to Yibam. So what do we say over there? So we said that even if the brother does Yibam to the Katana first, and then the Chareshes, which should be kosher, we have a problem because of Xera. So let's work this out. If the Katana is first, so then if the Katana was a real marriage, because remember the Katana is the Suffolk. If the Katana was a real marriage, so then whatever happens afterwards, the Chareshes is meaningless, and the Katana is allowed to stay married to her husband. Whatever happened afterwards doesn't affect her. If the Katana is not married at all, then she didn't fall to Yibam. She's just married. She's not a co-wife. There's nothing to talk about. So this case should be fine. But we make Xera to what would happen if the Chareshes were to go first. The Chareshes is a partial marriage, and therefore her marriage to the Yavam, her Yibam, is Chal. The Ketana's Yibam is also Chal. You have an Isser of Shtei Batim, now you have a problem, and they can't stay with him. Therefore, in order to prevent this from happening, we say that even in the case where the Ketana goes first, they can't stay together, they can't stay married. Gzeira Atu, where the Chareshes went first. Now the Mishnah, it's quoted in a Brisa, continues, and it says, what do you do? How do you send them both away? So it says the Chareshes, of course, can't get Chalitza, so she has to do Yibam and then be sent away with a get. But the Ketana, you could wait till she grows up and you could just do Chalitza for her. Now, it says Gemara, hold on a second, let's analyze this over here. What is the status of this Ketana? The only thing that you're making a Gzeira about is because of the Chareshes. The Ketana herself either is never married to the Yavam, is not Yibam, and this is a regular marriage, or the Ketana herself was married and fell to Yibam, and the worst thing she could possibly have had was a Bia Psula, because there was also a Zika on her co-wife. So if it's not a Yibam, then there's no reason she requires Chalitza. If it is a Yibam, so then Yibam was performed. He did a Yibam. It's a Bia Psula. You're telling me it's something Chabi holds Bia Psula is not a problem. Why does she need Chalitza here? She should do a get just in case she's married, and that's it. Obviously, we're not going with Reb Nechemia, and a Bia Psula over here would not break the Zika, and that's why she requires a Chalitza when she grows up. Says the Gemara, Rav Ashi says you could also prove this from the Reisha. You could prove that it's the Rabbanon and it's not Rabbi Nechemia. How so? So this is going back to the case where the Ketana and the Chareshes were sisters, married to brothers. And we said that if the Chareshes fell to Yibam, so he wasn't allowed to do Yibam, but if he did, she just gets a get and she's fine. Why don't we say that about the Ketana? Why don't we just say that if the Ketana did Yibam, she wasn't allowed to, but if she did Yibam, then she just needs to get a get and she's fine. Obviously, the reason we can't say that is because if the Ketana did Yibam, so then the Ketana was the sister of the Chareshes, who was a partial marriage. So the Ketana is one of two things. She's either not married at all, in which case, well, she's fine, everything's okay. There is no Yibam issues. However, if she was fully married, then she is a Achos Ishto B'mixas, because her sister, who's the Chareshes, is partially married to her Yavam. So then it would not be enough to just give her a get. Must be the reason it's not enough to give her a get is because it would be a Bia Psula, because it's a partial Achos Ishto, and therefore that doesn't break the Zika. And that's why she requires Chalitza. It's not enough to just give her a get and let her go free. She still has the Zika on her. So therefore, you clearly see that this Mishnah can't be Rabbi Nechemia either. So Gemara says this is not a proof. The Mishnah wasn't going to list the case of a Ketana that gets fixed up, because if you did an Isser, then she can go free. The Mishnah is not listing things where we're speaking about Isurim. The Ketana has a mutter way to go free, because she can get a Chalitza. She doesn't have to do a Yibum and then break it with a get. She just does a Chalitza. It's the end of any Zika she has, end of story. The reason we mentioned by the Charesh is because the Charesh can't do Chalitza, and therefore we said that the Charesh is going to be stuck. So we said that if there would be an Isser done, then we'll discuss an Isser. If there would be an Isser done, that would let her out, because then the Isser, the Yibum Be'Isser, would break her Zika, and then you can break that marriage with a get. But the Ketana, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to discuss how to get out of it with an Isser. Okay, this concludes this sugya. Now let's go to the Gemara on the Mishnah. So we had seen at the end of the Mishnah, the Gemara just has a brief comment here. We had seen at the end of the Mishnah, we had the case where a Gedola and a Ketana both fell to Yibum, and one of the brothers did Yibum on the Ketana, and then him or another one did Yibum on the Gedola. So the original Yibum on the Ketana was a suffix, and the Gemara had said that the Mishnah said there's a machlokes between Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar. What should happen now that Yibum was done on the Gedola, and now we don't know who is the one who's married? So Rabbi Elazar had said you teach the Ketana to do miyun, and that uproots the Ketana's entire relationship here, and the Gedola is the one that's married. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda named Shmuel said that halacha is like Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas said that halacha is like Rabbi Elazar. That's Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, the Tana. So The Gemara says they already said this in a different case where we had a similar machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and other Tanaim whether you teach a katana to do miyan as a solution or not. Here we're saying that Rabbi Elazar holds that you teach a katana to do miyan to get out of this pickle, and other Tanaim arguing. We said that Allah is like Rabbi Elazar. The previous case where we had this was where you have a man who's married to a regular gedola, and where you had a man who's married to a katana, that is, and her sister falls him to Yibam. Her sister, who is a gedola, falls him to Yibam. And over there, Rabbi Elazar said he teaches the katana to do miyan, so that there's no problem of achos ishto, and then he can do Yibam on the gedola. So the Gemara says, we already know that we hold like Rabbi Elazar Lamaisa, that you do teach a katana to do miyan. So the Gemara says, there's a reason you had to tell me the halacha in both cases. There were differences between the two. First of all, in this case, Yibam was already performed. You already did Yibam on the katana. So there's no mitzvahs Yibam anymore. You're stuck with the stuff. You don't know who the married one is. So fine. But meichitesi that you would teach her to do miyan in order to resolve that. There is no mitzvahs Yibam here anymore. In the case of the sister, which we had earlier, there you have the gedola falling to Yibam, and she's an achos ishto of the Kitana. So in order to get Yibam performed, in order to take care of the mitzvah of Yibam, there I would say maybe there you would tell her to do miyan. Now, if you would have only had the psak in our case, I would think maybe in our case you have a problem because the gedola is definitely falling to Yibam here. You had two women falling to Yibam, and I don't know if the gedola definitely fell to Yibam. I don't know if the bia of the katana pattered her or not. So therefore, I would say here there is a definite mitzvahs Yibam. Let's have the katana do miyan so that I can take care of it. The other case of the sister there, it wasn't real mitzvahs Yibam in the first place because she was an achos ishto the whole time. So I'm going to make the katana do miyan in order to take off the achos ishto. Stay with achos ishto, and there's never a mitzvah Yibam in the first place. We now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses briefly the halacha of a yavam katan, and then it talks about what there are two scenarios in which you may force a man to do chalitza. So the yavam katan cannot give a get. A katan is not able to give a get until he grows up. So if you have a katan who does yibum, whether to a katana or to a gedola, you have to wait until he grows up, and then she can get a get from him. Now, two cases of forcing. So the first is where the Yavam gives his wife a get. He does Yibam, and he gives the Yavama a get. But she says, he never did a bia with me. We were living together, but we never did a bia, and therefore he never really fulfilled the Yibam. So I don't need a get, I need a chalitza. So if it's within 30 days, we trust her, and we force him to give a chalitza. If it's after 30 days, we don't trust her, because nobody holds out that long without doing a bia that's permitted to them. And therefore, she has a problem, because she says that she's usher. She says that she never got chalitza, and she requires chalitza. So she can't marry anybody. He's fine, because we believe him. However, we do ask him nicely, please give her a chalitza, because she has a problem, she's usher. But we're not going to force him. Similar scenario would be if the Yavama says, I am making a neder, I'm not going to have any hana from the Yavam. So if she did it after her husband died, so we understand she's trying to force a way out of Yibum, so we don't allow that. We ask the guy nicely, do chalitza, but she can't force it. If she did while her husband was alive, then she did not intend to get out of it. And then we say, well, then we do force him to do chalitza because she's usher to have hana from him. If we knew then, though, that she was trying to preempt, however we would know, if we knew that she was trying to preempt a Yibum, then we would still not force him. We would go back to just asking him. The Gemara now has two kashas on this Mishnah. First of all, the Gemara wants to say this Mishnah seems not to be Rabbi Meir's opinion. Is it true that this is not Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Meir holds that a katan and ketana are not allowed to do yibum because they may be a stris and an islandess which are potter from yibum, and therefore there's an isser ishusach. Here we're saying that a katan and a ketana could do yibum. So Gemara says no, maybe this does fit with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir only said there's a halacha where it's one of them is a gadol or a gadol at least. So he asked her a katan with a gadola or a katana with a gadol. At least there, the gadol or the gadola would be chayiv kares for what they're doing. Here, they're both katanim. There's no isser. There's no onish in any of them. Maybe Rabbi Meir would say there's no problem. So the Gemara says that can't be. It still can't be Rabbi Meir. Because it says Gedola. The Mishnah says Yavama and a Gedola. It said if the Yavam katan, either a Yevama Kitana or Yevama Gedola. So Gemara says, no, that's not a kasha. It said if he did Yibum, it's not that he's allowed to. It's saying if he did already. Someone says, no, that can't be because we said that they should stay together. The Mishnah says they should stay together. If they're staying together, they're continuing to do bia, and each bia is an isser, according to Rabbi Meir, it's an isser eshesach, or potential eshesach. So we have to go back to first approach. This Mishnah is not Rabbi Meir. Okay, second kasha is how does a katan do yibum at all? The Torah says, l'hakam lachav shem. The point of yibum is to have children for the brother's name, the dead brother, but a katan can't have children. So the Gemara says, we have a lima that includes a katan. It says Yevamo Yavo Alahal, that includes any type of Yevama Yavo. Any type of Yavam could do the Yibum. Says Gemara, second source, there is no such thing as something which is usher now and then becomes mutter. So you want to say that the katan is usher him to do Yibum now and then it becomes mutter when he grows up. That can't be. So Gemara says, what's the proof of that? So we have a statement that if you have a case where there's no yibum b'shas nefila, it stays usher forever. You don't say that if that goes off, if there is no yibum b'shas nefila, but then the yibum goes on later, you don't say that it goes back to the mitzvah yibum. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe let's say that over here. That's exactly what I meant. I'll say that there's no yibum now, and it stay because he's a katan, and therefore there's no yibum even when he grows up because it started b'isser and it stays usher. Or says no, that can't be because you have a pasuk that says ki yeshu acham yachdav, even if they live together for only 1 day, because he was only 1 day old, still the mitzvah of yibum applies.